Welcome everybody to this session of the Homo Mimeticus Seminar. I called it Reloaded because it's going to be a question of transitioning from post-structuralism to post-humanism, and the Matrix is arguably one of the texts that can be useful to think about post-humanism. And we have a new team member, Carol Guess, whom I'll be introducing in a moment. But before, I thought it would be useful to, since I see some new faces, take some time to recontextualize what we're doing, especially in the context of the current pandemic crisis. I mean, it's a bad moment for many reasons, but it is a good moment for the humanities to actually test whether what we do, the texts that we read, the theories that we develop, are of any use to address the contemporary crisis. I mentioned that the Homo Mimeticus team has been busy during the pandemic, putting the mimetic theory to the test and trying to figure out whether what we are developing in theory in this academic context actually speaks to the current crisis. And I think it does in a number of ways that I'd like to take a moment to emphasize. And I thought, since some of you are new, I should be doing something that I haven't done, that is introduce more clearly and more directly some of the main concepts that are central to the Homo Mimeticus project. What we're doing is also propose a mimetic theory. A theory, I think, that was, I wouldn't say ahead of the game with respect to the current pandemic crisis, but nonetheless, we had some advantage because in 2016, I was engaging with Joseph Conrad. And Joseph Conrad has a novella that is not as known as Heart of Darkness, titled The Shadow Line, which is about pandemic. And so reading Conrad from the angle of pandemic led me to read literature on the pandemic crisis. I'm not a specialist, an epidemiologist. I don't have any particular competence, but just simply going outside the discipline of continental philosophy and literary studies and having a peek on what is said in 2014 with respect to pandemics led me to say that the shadow of epidemics looms large on the horizon. It seemed clear that this was going to happen sooner or later. And the effect of this is that when in January and February we started to take the crisis seriously, we already had some steps in that direction. And with respect to Mimesis, in many ways, the connection with coronavirus is very direct. The virus reproduces itself very quickly, and reproduction is one of the manifestations of mimesis. But it's, of course, the medical side of mimetic contagion. There is also another side which has to do with the fact that models and examples actually play a decisive role during a crisis like this one. And so we've had positive models that were then copied and introduced a form of therapeutic response, what we call the mimetic virus, but also emotional responses that show the importance of community and solidarity. The balcony scenes in Italy was one that caught the attention, a form of transmission of sympathy from a distance, from balconies. So this notion of pathos and distance was in a way displayed, staged. And so a form of positive mimetic contagion emerged during the mimetic crisis, but also, of course, forms of mimetic contagion that were negative, pathological, and in a way contribute, and are still contributing to disseminating the virus, so that the affective, emotional side of mimesis is intimately related to the viral contagion. From the moment that people do not wear masks, they are contributing to the viral contagion. So the current anti-mask movements are mimetic movements that are pathological in both the affective and the viral sense. And then just very recently, if you had the unfortunate kind of experience to watch the presidential elections, you see two candidates in the US who are at the antipodes. They're totally opposed. And yet they're caught in a dynamic that leads them to the exactly same accusations on both fronts, so that what is at the antipodes become the same, again, through a form of mimetic reciprocity. So these are just some of the examples that I think indicate that when we talk about mimesis, well, we switch on the news, we have it. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's important to rethink this concept. And so I'd like to take a moment to talk about what we started to designate as a mimetic term, or since mimesis is not an original concept, a return of mimesis that the Homo Mimeticus Seminar and project is promoting. And so I'll be going through some concepts, actually only 3 concepts. I want to introduce 3 concepts so that we have a common language. Just if you're new to the seminar, you know that the main focus of the seminar is to shift paradigms, is to maybe too big a word, but shift emphasis from dominant notions of mimesis understood as representation, a copy of the word, towards notions of mimesis that are embodied and that have to do with subjectivity, what we call Homo Mimeticus. So if you are in literary studies, the shift would be from realism to a form of mimetic subject that embodies mimesis. From representing the world, if you want, to imitating people. That's the general telos, if you want, of the seminar. And if we remind ourselves of what we've been doing over the past 2 or 3 years, we started in 2017 and we started with Plato's Republic. If the dominant trope to think about mimesis is the trope of the mirror, introduced in Book 10 of Republic, what we've been paying attention to is more Book 3 and the figure of the actor, who's kind of a chameleon in Republic 3, not Republic 10. And that's the figure of the Mimos, which Nikki is discussing in her dissertation, is at the center of Homo Mimeticus. So once again, not only a question of representing, like a painter represents the world, but of embodying mimesis. And if representation has traditionally been thought within the sphere of aesthetics, or in philosophy metaphysics, since for Plato, the mirror introduces an ontological distinction between different degrees of reality, from the forms to the phenomena to the aesthetic representations of these phenomena. We remain interested in aesthetic and metaphysics, of course, that doesn't go away, but we have also been opening it up to questions of ethics, politics, education, and so forth, since the second notion of mimesis seems connected to that. And so if you want some canonical text to read that you haven't read yet, the starting point to think about mimesis and literary representation is Erich Auerbach's influential book Mimesis, which I think is still a great text to read these days. We have been engaging with Günter Gebauer and Christoph Wolff's book Mimesis, subtitled Culture, Arts and Society. Last year, we had a workshop where we invited both Gebauer and Wolff to talk about mimesis. And in many ways, the Homo Mimeticus project furthers that line of inquiry opened up by Gebauer and Wolff, who posit mimesis as a human condition, what they call a conditio humana. So the idea is that mimesis is an anthropological, psychological reality that concerns Homo Mimeticus. That's the general frame and the general trajectory of the project. Now I call it a return, or we call it a return of mimesis because, of course, there have been thinkers who have thought the anthropological foundations of mimesis before. And an important concept that we also discussed in this seminar, I think the first year, was the notion of mimetic desire, which is linked to René Girard. If we want to propose a theory of mimesis, I think it's an important starting point. It's an interdisciplinary theory of mimesis that opens up imitation to desire, violence, rivalry, and so forth. It's an anthropological theory. But the question is, why the focus on desire? Why, of all possible affects, should we privilege mimetic desire? And there, the Homo Mimeticus project has been introducing what we call a genealogical perspective. That is, in order to critique a theory or to supplement a theory, it's useful to know how the theory was constituted and why it was constituted that way. And an important influence for Girard, he doesn't mention it very often, but he does towards the end of his career, is Alexandre Kojev's interpretation of Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit, where it's a question of master and slave dialectic, and specifically the phrase, the desire of the other appears. A desire that imitates desire. You might have heard it in Lacan. So Lacan was one of the attendees of Kojev's lecture. There were many others, like Merleau-Ponty, Bataille. And so the idea that desire somehow opens the main door to subjectivity was introduced in these lectures by Kojev, very influential lectures that foregrounded desire, and in particular the desire of the other, as a key concept. So Girard theory, it's a Hegelian, Kojevian theory. And you have to agree with that Kojevianism in order to endorse it. And you can ask yourself, do you feel Hegelian when you understand Mimesis? The second influence for Girard, genealogical influence, is a bit older, and it has to do with Girard's decision to split desire from identification. What he calls mimetic desire, in a way, it's a disjunction of two emotional ties that lead to a triangular relationship in which the subject identifies with a model and desires the same object that the model desires, leading to rivalry, an ambivalent relationship that leads to rivalry. And this triangular structure, I mean, if you see it represented here, you don't need to have read much Freud in order to recognize it. It's an inversion of the Freudian triangle. And so, yes, I think it's fair to say that Girard's theory is a Freudian, Hegelian theory that spoke to the 1960s. And now we are in a different period. And we can ask ourselves whether that frame still operates. Now, the first concept that I want to introduce that is part of the Homo Mimeticus project is the one of mimetic pathos. Rather than restricting mimesis to desire, we open it up to this notion, this Greek notion of pathos, which is difficult to translate. So classicists don't know exactly how to translate it. Is it passion? Is it affect? Is it event? What is sure is that it's linked to rhetoric. It's there in the poetics. And its pathos is particularly present when an actor speaks in mimetic speech, in the first person. And it's not only linked to the actor, but this pathos moves to the spectators. And so qualifying it as mimetic pathos is in a way doubling it down on mimesis, but because pathos is mimetic. It transmits itself from self to other, and it includes all affects. My starting point for the notion of pathos is Nietzsche. In a little quoted passage of The Will to Power, he defines the will to power as not a being, not a becoming, a pathos. And Nietzsche was, of course, a philologist, trained in classics, and was particularly attentive to tragedy. The main point that I want to make is that this notion of pathos, in many ways, overlaps with current returns of attention to affectivity, embodiment, performativity. I didn't use the term affect because these terms tend to come and go very quickly. So the affect term was introduced in the late 90s out of Deleuze, process philosophy. Ibrahim Assoumi wrote an important book that deals with affect. But it seems to me that while a concept like pathos, which has the ambivalences of activity and passivity, it's linked to a type of subjectivity that is not necessarily in control. As Dot says in Greek and the Irrational, it defines pathos as a force that takes possession of the subject. It seemed to me that there was an advantage in using this Greek notion. And so that's why our claim is that the affect term, the performative term, are actually returns to mimesis. If the Girardian model is Freudian Hegelian, the Homo Mimeticus project is more Nietzschean modernist in its orientation. And if there is a book that was useful for getting the grant, is the book mentioned here, The Phantom of the Ego, where I laid out this concept, very much in dialogue with Girard, but also post-structuralists like Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe. And so the main differences between the Girardian model and the Homo Mimeticus model is that if Girard focuses on desire, we open it up to all affects, be they good or bad. So the emphasis is not only on violence and rivalry and sacrifice, but also on positive emotions like sympathy, and compassion, and community, and laughter. They are mimetic too. And so it's a more, say, balanced evaluation of mimesis. And the second point is that there is a theology behind Girard's theory, which emerges especially in the second part of his career, and our foundations tend to be more atheological. It's a phrase that I borrow from Georges Bataille. And if Girard develops a system, we are more interested in tracing the movement of mimesis. What kind of movement? Well, in Girard, it's a triangle. I think that the pendulum indicates the type of movement that we have been tracing. And that leads us to the second concept I want to introduce after mimetic pathos. The concept of pathos of distance. It's a concept that I borrow from Nietzsche. It's well known that Nietzsche, in the Genealogy of Morals, uses the concept of pathos of distance in order to mark a distinction between the masters and the slaves. The masters are anti-mimetic, they're individualist, whereas the slaves belong to the herd and are mimetic. So that side is well known. I've been arguing for a while that it's only one part of the story. The other part of the story is that Nietzsche himself is very vulnerable to the notion of pathos. Hence he calls the will to power a pathos. And so in the notion of pathos of distance, you've got both. You have vulnerability to mimesis and distance from mimesis. Or you might argue the notion of pathos of distance oscillates between a mimetic conception of the subject, open to pathos, and an anti-mimetic subject that is prone to distance. And I think this is a point that I need to stress because the phrase Homo Mimeticus might lead to the idea that humans are all open inevitably to mimesis and that there is nothing that we can do to resist mimesis. And my argument, on the contrary, is that there are anti-mimetic tendencies at work in the main figures that we are studying, and that the type of Homo Mimeticus we are proposing is both vulnerable to mimesis and critical of mimesis. There is both an anti-mimetic tendency and a mimetic tendency at the heart of Homo Mimeticus. And the anti-mimetic tendency, in a way, is more important because it's anti-mimetic subjects, individuals, who notice mimetic tendencies. If one is part of a group, one doesn't even notice mimesis. It's a bit like water. When swimming in the water, you don't notice it after a while. But if you're outside of the water, then you notice it. Oh, that's mimetic. I don't know that. So the anti-mimetic tendency is important, but also the realization that we're all vulnerable to that force, that we are not better than anybody else. We are caught in a wave, and that force carries us away. So there are notions that are linked to mimetic subjectivity, like sympathy, which etymologically means feeling with, sympathos, not feeling for, on the side of the mimetic subject. And to develop an anti-mimetic subjectivity, we have been proposing genealogies. That is, developing an account of the theories of sympathy and being very suspicious of moral theories. I mean, Nietzsche, of course, is very suspicious of morality. He traces how sympathy and midlife emerge. So there is a critique. And if herd behavior, to use a Nietzschean term, is on the side of the mimetic subject, a form of radical individualism is part of the anti-mimetic subject. And both operate at the same time. It's not either or, it's both and, depending on the context. So I won't enter into other concepts that we develop, but the main idea is that there is a tension or oscillation between mimetic and anti-mimetic drives in Homo Mimeticus. And this notion of phantom of the ego, which I also steal from Nietzsche, indicates precisely that. That is a phantom that is not a copy, a picture of reality, but a psychological phantom that leads the ego to imitate others, leading to a dissolution of selfhood that Nietzsche is critical of, and yet at the same time vulnerable to. Fascism, for instance, is on the side of mimesis, as anti-fascism is on the side of anti-mimesis, but in order to effectively critique fascism, I've been arguing, it is useful if you experience the pathos of fascist leaders. So it's not, once again, an opposition, it's both at the same time. And if we engaged with mirror neurons, it's in a way because the neurosciences have been confirming what a long tradition of mimesis have been paying attention to, that is, we are open to involuntary form of imitation. And we read from neuron theory. At the same time, it should be clear that this is an anti-reductionist theory. So it's not at all an attempt to take the hard sciences as a model for our theory. On the contrary, we are arguing that the hard sciences are finally catching up. Very different. And so that leads to the third and last concept that I want to introduce. And there is a paradoxical movement internal to what I call pathology, spelled a little bit weirdly. And I thought it might be useful to clarify this notion of pathology. And the sources are both ancient and modern. And very often when it comes to mimesis, we speak of the quarrels between the ancient and the moderns when it comes to aesthetics. But in this case, there is actually a continuity between the ancient and the moderns. Specifically, if you look at Plato, there is a passage in the Republic where he argues that physicians, and when he speaks of physicians, he has in mind physicians of the soul, since the Republic is an account of the soul, would prove most skilled if they themselves had suffered all diseases and were not of very healthy constitution. Of a paradoxical idea that in order to be a good physician, one needs to be a little bit vulnerable to sickness, maybe sick herself in order to cure. And there is a psychology of mimesis internal to the Republic, which Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, that I've mentioned earlier, in a book titled Typography, I think lays out very clearly. And Lacoue-Labarthe is a second important source after Girard. But actually the main source is still Nietzsche. He is, of course, Nietzsche very often qualified as an anti-Platonic philosopher. He overturns metaphysics and so forth. Yes, he is very critical of Plato, but Nietzsche attacks only causes that are worth attacking. And so he deems Plato one of those causes, Plato's idealism. And so there are many continuities between Nietzsche and Plato that are actually there if one takes the time to read the corpus. For instance, on the question of the physician. And here is one of the clearest, I think, description by Nietzsche where he defines what he calls perspectivism. He says, to look from a morbid perspective towards healthier concepts and values, and again, conversely, to look down from the abundance and certainty of rich life into the secret labor of the instinct of decadence, that is what I have practiced most. Meine längste Übung. He's an expert in that inversion of perspective, looking at sickness from the point of view of health, but also of health from the point of view of sickness. And it's a truism that Nietzsche was, of course, a sick man. That matters when he speaks about the body. And so that diagnostic perspectivism is what I call pathology. And it's part of this movement of oscillation between anti-mimetic and mimetic tendencies. But actually the movement turns into a kind of spiral. The movement that we are tracing, it's more of a spiraling movement in which the philosophical physician who is herself affected by the sickness can put that sickness to use in order to diagnose it. An infection by mimetic pathos can be turned into a discursive logos on that pathos. A logos that is not dissociated from the pathos but draws substance from it. That is a spiraling movement that you can find in a number of authors, Nietzsche, Bataille, Conrad, and many others. And that can be represented by Zelig, for instance. And that shows how a first-person internal account of pathos can be put to use by a third-person, more outside, distant diagnostic. So I don't like notions like subjective and objective or kind of affective and rational when they're set in an opposition all that much. But the idea is that an experiential pathos, an experience of mimesis, is essential in order to develop critical diagnostics. And that is what we call pathologies, both sickness and critical logos on mimetic pathos. And so, to conclude, well, we've been diagnosing a number of manifestations of the pathologies of mimesis, from hypnotic dispossession to rituals of trance, musical intoxication, and emotional contagion, all of which surface in the modernist period very powerfully, but it seemed to me that all these movements are reappearing in a different form in the contemporary crisis, in the contemporary period, and call for new pathologies, new discourses on the power of pathos. And so, yes, interdisciplinarity is often mentioned as something that we should practice and is valued by the university. It's actually very difficult to pursue interdisciplinary work simply because you have to work more and master more disciplines. But there is a value in interdisciplinarity because a problem, certainly like a problem like the coronavirus, doesn't stop at a disciplinary border. That I think we can all agree on. And if the task of the university is to try to understand the present on the shoulders of the past, then there is an advantage in learning and engaging with other disciplines. And so the Homo Mimeticus project has been developing psychological aspects of mimesis, the notion of the mimetic unconscious, for instance, anthropology of mimesis, musicology. Daniel was with us and developed that side, crowd psychology, political theory, and different perspectives. And the question is how to avoid dispersion. Well, we have a theory for that. We have our own theory with concepts, a movement within those concepts, and I think it is that allows for an engagement with different disciplines. And that is, we are looking at it, reading frame, that allows an engagement and a dialogue with what we're doing anyway, and different disciplines. And, do you have any questions about this very kind of bird-eye overview of the theory? The mimetic pathos, pathos of distance, patho, logies. There are just three, there are more, but I thought it would be useful to have those three clarified.